Well, good morning, everyone. That was, it's too cold. That was very unenthusiastic. We'll try again. Bring some more energy on a cold morning. Good morning, everyone. Hey, thank you. That's fantastic. Welcome to another installment of our series on Faith Talks, All In. And today we're talking about how we can be all in with our soul. A theme, as you well know, is it well with our soul? In this season of Advent, we hear the psalmist declare, "For God alone, my soul waits in silence." And we also listen to Mary singing, "My soul magnifies the Lord." Waiting or magnifying, longing or rejoicing. What is our soul? What is your soul doing in this Advent season? And what is a soul anyway? Come hear about the idea of an immortal soul, not as something separate from our bodies, but as the core of our being that finds its deepest joy in the coming of Jesus. Thank you all for being here this morning, both in person and worshiping with us over Zoom. My name is Ben Malakote. I'm a member here at Covenant, and if all of us at Christmas time experience the expectation for receiving some gift as children, some toy that we really wanted, and you get the box in front of you, and you think, this is it. I'm going to open it up, and you open it up, and it's socks. For those of you who came expecting to see Grace or Mary Kate, I expect that you're feeling that same sort of thing right now. But thank you for being here. We are thrilled this morning to welcome back Dr. Martha More-Keish for the third time. And I'm sorry that we walked in here late. We were having such an engaging conversation. For those of you who have not heard Dr. More-Keish speak in the past, I think you're going to be thrilled to hear her talk and to hear her perspective. Martha is the J.B. Green Professor of Theology at Columbia Theological Seminary. And today she's going to provide some theological framework for us as we consider the idea of a soul, particularly in light of Advent. As I said, this is Martha's third time with us here at Covenant. Um, the first was to talk about her work as a member of the special committee of the PCUSA considering a new confession, which she continues to do. And most recently, earlier in this series, during our consideration of what it meant to be all in with your heart. So here we started with heart, and here we are with soul. In addition to her calling as a professor, Martha is an ordained minister in the PCUSA. And in addition to her scholarship, we have heard from folks who know her well that she is known for how she teaches and cares for her students at Columbia and beyond. We're especially grateful that Martha would take the time to travel up here. This is a busy time of the year for everybody, but especially for ministers. So thank you for taking the time to be here with us in this incredibly busy time of year. And I'm told, I understand that in addition to the busyness that we all have, every year during December, you host the community at Columbia for a reading of a Christmas carol. Is that right? Yeah, well, fantastic. Well, if you want to, if we have a little extra time, maybe you can give us a dramatic reading as well. So, all of you, thank you very much for being here. Would you please give a very warm welcome to Dr. Martha More-Keish? And I should add as well, before I turn the floor over to Dr. More-Keish, that you have note cards and pens all around you. We will have time for questions at the end, so be taking good notes and submitting good questions. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Ben. Yeah, we were having a great conversation, and then we looked down and said, oh, it's 9:32. Whoops, we need to get into the room. It is good to be back with you all. Thank you for being here, for braving the cold. So as Ben said, and as you have perhaps read in the announcement about this, today we're going to be talking about the soul. And here on the screen a reminder of what you already know about your theme for this year, all in heart, soul, mind, and strength. And just a reminder about one place where we see that connection to our Presbyterian and Reformed tradition from the Westminster Shorter Catechism, which tells us why we're focusing on these four things. What is the sum of the Ten Commandments? It says. The sum of the Ten Commandments is to love the Lord our God with all of our heart. That's what we talked about in September when I was here, with all of our soul. That's today. And then I think in the spring, you're going to be moving on to think about strength and mind, or mind and strength. But today it is what does it mean to love the Lord with all of our soul? And so, as Ben already said, there are these two texts that were inspiring me to think about this as I was preparing to be with you this morning. And both of these are texts that we encounter during Advent. This is one of the Psalms that we often hear during Advent. And the first two verses, which get repeated then later in Psalm 62, begin like this: For God alone, my soul waits in silence. From him, that is God, comes my salvation. And so this is one way of capturing the mood of Advent, right? If Advent literally means coming, the mood of Advent is waiting. How is it that we are waiting? And here, Psalm 62 connects that with the soul. What does it mean for our soul to be waiting? So there we encounter the soul, the language of soul, in the Hebrew scriptures in the Old Testament. And then we also see it here in the New Testament in Mary's song, which we may be hearing about in worship this morning. This is one of the texts that is often preached on. Has anybody been to church already this morning? Anybody been to worship? Do we know? Is this text going to be part of what we hear, the Magnificat? Mary said, "My soul magnifies the Lord." No, not this morning. Okay. Not at late, not at the early service. Okay, so stay tuned for 11. We'll see. This is in many churches around the world. This is one of the texts that will be featured in churches this morning. So familiar to many of us, right? Mary said, "My soul magnifies the Lord." This text sometimes called the Magnificat because the Latin word for magnifies. My soul magnifies the Lord, and my spirit rejoices in God, my Savior. This is what Mary sings when she is made aware that she is going to be bearing Jesus, the Messiah. And so again, it's that word soul that I want us to pay attention to, right? Both of these texts then raise for us this question: what do we mean by this word soul? So I invite you to think, just as we're starting to unpack this, when you hear that language of soul. I've been asking my my two daughters this week, and I've been asking other people as I ran into them, what do you think this means, this word soul? So I invite you to think about this. What do you think about when you think about this word soul? And so when we're thinking about our soul waiting for the Lord, or our soul magnifying the Lord, what are what do you think of? I'm going to share with you some things that I think of. How many of you have seen this Pixar movie from a few years back? Some of us who have children, perhaps our grandchildren. Great movie called Soul. So this is one of the more recent cultural interpretations of the idea of a soul. In that movie, if you've seen it, you know that the portrayal is of a world in which souls are disembodied. This in some ways familiar to the way many of us might think of a soul, disembodied pre-existent entities that exist in a world before, and then they receive training, they receive ideas and sort of character traits before they then come to earth and are joined to a body. And then they also have existence after death. The main character you see here is a jazz musician who gets has an accident and gets detached from his soul, and then there is a sequence in which he acquires the wrong soul for a time, and it's a great movie. You should see it, but for our purposes, it's just an example of a common assumption that we have about a soul being an entity that has an existence prior to its joining to the body, and then also has an existence perhaps after the body is an accident or dies, right? So that's one portrayal of a soul. Here's another. If you Google images of soul, this is the first thing that came up. So I thought I'd share it with you. You can try it yourself, right? Do a Google search on Google Images, and you might get something like this. Often, soul connected with. Notice where it's located. It's a kind of a light in the heart space. I think many of us might kind of think of something like this. This image comes from a more Eastern religious view, in which the soul is understood to be that light at the center of the being that also has some existence within the body, but also somewhat distinct from the body. But by engaging in various bodily practices, this person is in a posture of meditation. By engaging in various bodily practices, we might learn to discipline the soul, or nurture the soul, or enable the soul to shine more brightly, so that there is a connection between the soul and the body. Here's another one. Anybody fans of Soul Train? This might date us, some of us. Okay. Yeah, I didn't, but I remember it from my childhood vaguely. But it's interesting to think about how right, the word soul is also associated with a certain genre of music, particularly emerging from the African American tradition. And in a little bit of research I did, I learned that the connection of soul music with that word soul is because of soul music's roots in gospel music, and the idea of gospel music being intended to nurture, even save people's souls. And so that there is that connection between the power of music and the way in which music itself can influence, perhaps even save our souls. Okay, so there's some ideas. You may have your own ideas when you hear the word soul, what you think of, but this was just to get us thinking. Here's another image. Um, this is an image from the 19th century that, in a way, perhaps oddly to us, but portrays the way that in Western Christian traditions, the soul has often been portrayed as feminine, female. This is a female form. This is a picture understood to be the soul departing the body at death. Interestingly, right, the body there is a male body, but the soul portrayed as the female aspect of that person departing at death. So there's all kinds of things we could talk about. Probably don't have time this morning, but we could, if we wanted to, talk about the way that the soul in Western understanding is often gendered female, regardless of the body of the person it occupies. Lots of Western Christian mystics, perhaps particularly in the medieval period, had a lot of love poetry between God and the soul. I see some nodding over here. You may be familiar with this tradition, that the soul perceived as female is in a love relationship with God perceived as male. So drawing on texts like the Song of Songs, perceived as a love story between God and the human soul. Interesting. Another part of our history about what we inherit as Christians in thinking about the soul. So what then does the scripture have to say to us about where we get this idea of soul? We're going to back way up here to the Hebrew scriptures. And I know that some of you in the room, I'm sure, have heard my colleague Brennan Breed. Raise your hand if you've heard Brennan. Yeah, and I probably talked at length to you about Nephesh. Am I right? Yeah, I'm guessing that's true. So I don't want to intrude on his territory. Brennan, by the way, side note, you may or may not know, Brennan is also a skilled amateur bluegrass musician. So so next time he comes, you can ask him about this. At our party on Friday night, where we did the reading of the Christmas Carol, he played the fiddle for all of the music, one of his many talents. Anyway, okay, so in the Hebrew scriptures, I've just given you one verse here, one of the famous ones, where you see a description of soul, and it's this word nephesh, and I've highlighted in red the English and the Hebrew so that you can see that word soul. That's the word nephesh in the Hebrew. So this is the familiar second creation narrative, right, from Genesis 2. The Lord God formed man, that's the Adam, the Adam, of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. That's the word neshama. And man, or the Adam, the earth creature, became a living soul. Notice the language there, right? It's interesting. There you've got the description of the formation of the material body from the dust. So you do have that. And then you have this action of God breathing into that earth creature, the Adam, the breath of life. And that Adam, that earth creature, became a living soul. So it's not, notice what it does not say. It does not say that the Lord God inserted a soul or breathed a soul into that body. No, this Adam, the earth creature, the man here, is formed, and then God breathes, and the earth creature, the Adam, the man, became a living soul. Interesting, right? So there you get the idea that the nephesh is not naming a separate kind of spiritual entity that is inserted, right, into the body as a vessel. No, that it's the whole person who is described as the living soul. Interesting, right? So that's one example. Now, having said that, it is also important to say that this word nephesh is used in multiple ways in the Hebrew scriptures. And again, you may want to talk more about this later. The way that Brennan probably uncovered for you the multiple ways that nephesh is used. Sometimes you do get more of a sense of a semi-distinct sort of power or life within the human person, sort of like that glowing heart that we saw in one of those images earlier. So sometimes we get that. Sometimes we get this idea that the soul is a way of naming the whole living person. So nephesh sometimes is more distinct, sometimes is more a way of naming the whole living person. For our purposes, I just want us to notice that it has to do with life. It has to do with some kind of sentience. So it's not just like plant life. The Hebrew scriptures do not talk about plant life having nephesh or being nephesh. There are creatures, including human creatures, but they're creatures who have some kind of knowing, some kind of awareness or self-awareness. Bugs, for instance, are not described as being nephesh, right? But lions or a leviathan or humans are nephesh. So some kind of living quality of self-awareness seems to go along with the nephesh. So in the Old Testament, we get language of nephesh, we get language of bodies, we get language of spirit also. The word ruach, you may have encountered that word. Ruach, which usually gets translated as spirit, is sometimes also associated with human beings. And the word ruach can sometimes be used interchangeably with nephesh, but sometimes they're described as two different aspects of the human being. It's not a systematic description, is what I'm trying to tell you. There's not a systematic kind of here's the body, here's the nephesh, here's the ruach, or here's the body, here's the nephesh, right? It's more organic and varied than that when you look at the Hebrew scriptures. But nephesh is the word that usually gets translated as soul, okay? Now, what happens when you get to Greek thought, which then is part of what influences our New Testament thinking? Before we get to the New Testament scriptures, I wanted to introduce you to our friend Plato and his teacher Socrates. Raise your hand if you've read Plato at some point earlier in your life, right? Okay, so some of you may be familiar with this text. This is a little excerpt from one of Plato's dialogues called the Phaedo, where we get one of these classic descriptions of the way that this famous Greek philosopher, at least, understood the human soul. So, Ben, can I get your help? Do you have that? Do you have that handheld mic that you could come up here and play a part with me? Do you want to be Socrates or do you want to be Cebes?
In real life, I want to be
Yeah.
Socrates, but for this purpose, I want to be Cebes.
You
Thank you.
sure?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, because I'm happy for you to be Socrates. Okay. Okay, so this is just a little section. In the Phaedo, Socrates is preparing for his own death. And so this leads to a long conversation between Socrates and some of his disciples about what happens at death. Okay, so this is going to set up his conversation about the soul and the body. Okay, so I'll be Socrates. When the soul and the body are united, then nature orders the soul to rule and govern, and the body to obey and serve. Now, CBs, which of these two functions is akin to the divine and which to the mortal? Does not the divine appear to you to be that which is which naturally orders and rules, and the mortal to be that which is subject and servant?
True.
Thank you. And which does the soul resemble?
I'd say the soul resembles the divine and the body the mortal. There can be no doubt of that, Socrates.
Well, then reflect, CBs. Of all which has been said, is not this the conclusion that the soul is in the very likeness of the divine and immortal and intellectual and uniform and indissoluble and unchangeable? And the body is in the very likeness of the human and mortal and unintellectual and multiform and dissoluble and changeable. Can this, my dear CBs, be denied?
It cannot.
Thank you. Round of applause for Ben. So what do we see here? This is just one little excerpt where we see what is generally agreed upon by many Greek philosophers, including apparently Socrates and certainly Plato, that when we're talking about the soul, we're talking about an immortal, unchangeable essence, which is basically much more like the divine, and it is that which connects us with the divine. And therefore, Socrates goes on to say, at death, what happens? The body disintegrates, returns to the dust. The soul departs and unites with God, with the divine, which is its proper origin. Okay, this might sound familiar to you. And it has been very influential in Christian thought. But I want you to notice how different that is from this. So first of all, just notice this, right? That when we're talking about the Hebrew view of the human soul, it's not a separate, right, immortal being that gets inserted in the body. It is more of a description of the living being that has the breath of God in it. But it's more united with the body. So we have, therefore, in Christian New Testament scriptures, we have some diversity. There is the influence of the Hebrew scriptures, and there's also the influence of Greek philosophy. And both of these things come together in what we see in the New Testament. And so this returns us then to one of the verses that we looked at the very beginning, the beginning of the Magnificat from Luke. Mary said, "My soul magnifies the Lord, and my spirit rejoices in God, my Savior." You can see here that the Greek word is psyche. It looks like psyche to us, from which we get the word psychology, right? You recognize that word. The Greek is actually pronounced psyche. That what looks like a Y to us is actually in Greek pronounced like an U. But so the psyche, what are we talking about when we're talking about the psyche or the psyche? What are we talking about? Sometimes we're talking about the way that Plato thought of it. The psyche, or the psyche, is that distinct entity that occupies the human body, but that ultimately departs the body and goes to rejoin God, and the body is left behind. But that doesn't seem to be quite accurate to what Mary is saying here. It does not seem like she's simply describing a distinct part of herself. She seems to be describing something that's more like her whole self, right? It's her most selfness, if you will. My soul magnifies the Lord, and my spirit rejoices in God, my Savior. She seems to be reaching for some way in which her very life itself is giving glory to God. Another passage that I've given you here from Mark 8:35 to 36. Interestingly, I wanted to show you this because it shows you the way that this same word, suke or psyche, is translated differently in the New Testament depending on the context. Here, it's translated as life, right? So here's the text. Jesus is speaking. For those who want to save their suke, life, those who want to save it will lose it. And those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. For what will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life, their suke? Interesting, right? What difference does it make to think about this word suke or psyche as life rather than soul? That feels different, doesn't it? And I think that that's important when we read the New Testament, which was, of course, originally in Greek. It's important to notice that we shouldn't just import our presumptions about soul into what we're reading in the Greek New Testament, because it may or may not actually reflect what is there, right? It doesn't, for example, in the Mark passage, this is not talking about the soul as some kind of or the suke as a separate entity, like with Plato, right? That is inserted in the body and then is removed at death. This is talking about Jesus here is talking much more about the suke as the life, as the power of life within us, right? The whole life that is within us. And he's talking about what does it mean to save that? Not to the exclusion of the body, but it's much more about the wholeness of the life that includes the body as well as the more immaterial parts of ourselves. Now, having said all of that, I want to take a look at what happens when we go to John Calvin, our older brother in the faith in the Presbyterian Reformed tradition in the 16th century. How did Calvin talk about this idea of the soul? Calvin is a great biblical exegete, reading in both Hebrew and Greek, very interested in trying to uncover what the scriptures are saying, wrote commentaries, as you may know, on almost every book of the Bible, not quite all, but most books of the Bible. And he's also a man of his time, right? And he's also a man of his time. And so when he comes to this question about the soul, he says this. He says, and I'm quoting him here in the translation, man, that is humanity, consists of a soul and a body. Okay, so Calvin just says right off the bat, just takes it as for granted that human beings all consist of two parts, a soul and a body. And he says the soul is the nobler part. And what does he mean by soul? Well, you see here on the screen his language. The soul is an immortal yet created essence. So, two things there, right? Immortal, meaning it doesn't die. So, there you can think of Plato, very similar to what we saw with Socrates. The soul is immortal, but created, meaning God is still the author, right? God is still the creator of that soul, right? The soul didn't come from nowhere, it came from God. Okay, so the soul is an immortal yet created essence bound, Calvin says, to the prison house of the body. That's a quote. The prison house of the body. So that the body is portrayed as a container for the soul, a temporary container for the soul, but from which the soul will eventually be released. Now, I want to say a word about that language of the prison house of the body. You may be wondering, why was Calvin so negative about the body? Anybody know the answer to that? He's a He is a medievalist. He inherits medieval thought, and medieval thought is in Western medieval thought is informed by Latin. And in Latin, the word body is soma, and the word prison is sema. It's a difference of one vowel. And this is an interesting point where I'm not making this up. Actually, I've read this, right? Scholars say this. So that it's an interesting example of the way that language itself can shape our understanding of the world. Just the words that we use shape what we see, our perception of the world. And it seems clear that at least this is one factor in influencing this negative view of the human body as a prison house, right? The soma is a sema. The body is a prison from which we need to escape. Now, how does that relate to the soul? It reinforces this kind of dualism that says that the body is that negative, right, container restricting the soul. And what's really most valuable about ourselves is this immortal essence, which longs to reunite with God, to be released from the body. And that's more or less what Calvin says. Now, he does say it is the case that the body is good. It is, right, part of God's good creation. He acknowledges that. But on the whole, he thinks that the image of God is primarily associated with the soul, not the body. The image of God is primarily associated with the soul. If we want to know where it is that we reflect God, it is in our soul. And what does our soul consist of for Calvin? These two things primarily: understanding, knowledge, and also will, which is our ability to make decisions and act on them. So the body is pretty minimal when you think about it in Calvin's view. The body is this material instrument that carries out what the soul discerns, understands, and directs the body to do. So, what just in a nutshell, that's all I'm going to say to you about Calvin. But I might invite you to think what's helpful here, and what's potentially problematic about Calvin's view of the soul. I think that there are some helpful things, right? Calvin recognizes that the human being has great capacities for understanding, for uniting with God, for making decisions and acting on them, for loving, right? All of these things, Calvin says, are part of what it means to be human. And he associates those things with what he calls the soul. In all of these ways, Calvin then affirms that human beings are good and valuable, beloved by God, right? These are all good things. But the problem that I think we have to see in Calvin's view is the stark separation of all of that value and goodness from the material physical body, which he sees as pretty starkly distinct, not in any way influencing the soul, except in maybe negative ways, and from which ultimately we want to escape. I think that's the thing that we need to be careful of in reading Calvin on the soul. So then, what is the problem and what is the promise of this language of soul? A few years ago, I heard reflections from one of my colleagues who worked in the library at Columbia at the time, Griselda Larte. Griselda is from Ghana originally, and she preached one day about the soul in West African thought. And she spoke about the soul as a very important thing in the West African worldview. She says that the human soul is breathed into the human person at birth and returns to the spirit world after death. She says the soul is precious, making each human being valuable and distinct. So that sounds right to me. That sounds good to me, right? And I think that we can learn from people like Griselda talking about the value of the human soul. But what she did not say is that that soul is separate from the body, or that the body is therefore bad or negative, right? She is talking about the soul as something that affirms the goodness, the life, the worth of each individual person. So, what you may have already picked up from what I'm saying is that most scholars today, most Christian theologians and philosophers reject what was for a long time assumed as a simple dualism between body and soul. So, describing the body as a kind of disposable shell, right, that is only a temporary carrier for the precious soul. That seems to be problematic. And yet there does seem to be some kind of a dual sense of self if you just think about your own experience of life, right? We all seem to experience the world as both something that we experience through our senses, sight and sound and touch, but there's also a part of ourselves, some aspect of ourselves that is more than simply restricted to our physical selves, right? There's the imagination, there are the passions, there is the ability to love, um, and these things don't seem to be simply reducible to our physical bodies. And so theologians today, many theologians today, speak about, instead of talking about body and soul, talk about spirited bodies, or right, more integrated selves. I've brought this book along in case you wanted to see it. This is Nancy Murphy, is a theologian, excuse me, out in California at Fuller Seminary, who has done a lot of work in the conversation between theology and science. And she argues for a more integrated sense of self, such that our, what we might call our souls, names that set of capacities and characteristics that emerge from our embodied lives in the world, right? Our histories, our relationships, our culture, all of those things shape us into who we are, right? Such that it's not that there's body over here and soul over here. It's not that, as we see in the movie, the characteristics of a person are all determined and infused prior to birth, and then they come into the world and they just walk around in this shell of a body. No, right? There's an interaction there between our lived experience and what we might call our soul, our lives, our particularities. And so then what is helpful if we're going to use this word soul? What is the value of talking about a soul? I have here, I'm not sure how visible this is. Is this fairly visible to you? These are just some kind of key points that I think are helpful in continuing to use this word soul, that make it meaningful, but that try to avoid some of the kind of dualism that I think has been problematic. So, number one, that language of soul, I think, points to the ultimate worth of each human person. The ultimate worth of each human person. Last night, I was at dinner with Edna Bacon, and I don't know if you noticed this, Edna, but there was one point we were talking about somebody, and you said, she's a good soul. Do you remember that? And I noticed that. And I thought, yeah, I think what are we saying when we say that? She's a good soul. That's not talking about a good soul as like just that internal, right, ethereal part of her is good. No, I think, Edna, I think what you meant was she's a good person. She's a good, valuable, worthwhile, beloved person. She's a good soul. So the worth of each human person. I think also this language of soul helps us to capture the particularity of each human person. So a soul is a way of naming individuality. It's not just a kind of generic term, right? That we have, I mean, okay, some people do say you got soul, and they mean that in a different way, right? But when you talk about a soul, we're talking about the particular characteristics, the particular giftings of persons, right? That it's not just generic. It points to particularity. I think also this language of soul seeks to name the central core of a person, not the peripheral extraneous things, but what is at the heart of a person. There, I just realized I use the word heart and soul interchangeably because I think actually there's something right about that, that heart and soul are not wildly different. In a way, they're pointing to something, both pointing to something central about a human being. I think that ultimately this word soul is trying to name the whole person, right? Not just a part of a person, not just a piece of a person, but the whole person. And therefore, this last point, rather than saying that a person has a soul, better, I think, to say that a person is a soul. All the way back to Genesis, again, remembering what we saw in Genesis 2:7, right? That when God breathed the breath of life into the Adam, the earth creature, the human, he became a living soul. He became a living soul. And I think that that is better than for trying to think about what we mean by this language of soul, which then brings us to this final question. What does it mean? What does it mean for our soul to wait? And what does it mean for our soul to magnify the Lord in this season? I think what it means is that we, our whole selves, our indescribably particular selves, ourselves that are beloved by God, we are called to wait for and to welcome the God who comes to us in Jesus, not just a part of ourselves, not just our generic selves, but our very most real selves are summoned to be in relationship and to welcome the one who is coming. I think what I want to do is to stop here. I have a final poem I want to share with you before we leave, but before I do that, I'm going to pause here for questions and answers, and then and leave you with a text. Mm.
Thank you very much, Martha. If you have questions, please jot those down on the note cards, and we'll have ushers or greeters come around and grab those. Since we started with Soul Train, if you have particularly funky dances that you would
Yes,
like to share with us,
absolutely.
we will also accept those in lieu of questions. I'm gonna start with the facilitator's privilege and ask the first question. So you've given us a robust and healthy theology
Hmm.
of the soul. What are the practical
Hmm.
implications of that indivisibility of soul and body for how we care for and use and experience our own bodies, and how we care for and encounter the bodies of others?
Oh, that's a great question. Thank you for that. I think that certainly one of the things it means is that when, as we interact with one another, that we take seriously and value the embodied realities um, that we have, and that we do not speak of one another or treat ourselves and our bodies as disposable or less valuable than other parts of ourselves, right? And so I do think it means valuing the capacity, the need for things like rest and care of our bodies so that we can, right, magnify the Lord. um, I don't want to be oversimplistic about this, but I do think it's true that uh, when we are tired, or when people we know are tired or traumatized, when we look at people around the world who are not, who do not have enough to eat, or who are unhoused, or who are right, who do not have basic bodily needs, it can impair the ability of that person to function well. It can in fact impair the ability of that person um, to glorify God with all of their being. I mean, I think there is something about Maslow's hierarchy of needs right here, that we need to recognize that bodies are real, and that our souls benefit from having our bodily needs cared for. So I think that at a very basic level is one thing I would say. And that one way in which then we might magnify the Lord is to actually care for the bodies of people who are in need. How about that?
I think that's a great answer.
Something like
Yeah.
that.
So we've got a couple here. As you know, when you come to Covenant, we're going to toss you easy softball questions. So we'll start with one of the easier ones. What does it mean that man is made in the image of God?
Oh gosh, yes, no, that's a great question, we much contested, right? Does anybody want to fess up to that question? Where did that question come from? Anybody? Nobody's going to claim it. Oh, okay, great. So, so I wonder if you have particular context for the question, because right? There's a long conversation about this in Christian theology. Yeah. Right, which is what Calvin said, right? And so I think that what does it mean to be made in the image of God? Again, much contested. But I am going to say, I think what it means to be made in the image of God is we glimpse most clearly in Christ. So what do we learn about the image of God from looking at Christ? We glimpse a person. It's not. I think I want to say first off, it's not about physical appearance, right? So in valuing the body, I'm not meaning to say that the physical appearance in some kind of literal way images God, right? But I am saying that bodies are an important and non-negotiable part of what it means to be human. So what does it mean when we look at Christ, to who is right in the New Testament proclaimed to be the image of God? We see someone who is fully human, and who is committed to being in a relationship of love both to God and to neighbor. So this may be wildly oversimplifying, but I think that's a place where I'd want to begin. That the image of God is not about physical appearance. It's also not primarily about individual accomplishment or capacity. It is about the way that we are collectively called to love God and to love neighbor. And that's what it means. It's a calling to, it's the image of God is it's a statement about who we are that calls us to be in right, loving relationships with God and with our neighbor. That's where I would want to begin. Yeah, thank you. It's a great question.
Great. Can you comment on the views of Islam and Hinduism and Buddhism on this soul and body dualism versus?
Yeah, right. Quick question. Let me
You have
say
30 seconds.
Okay, so let me say this much. Um, as much as we need to be careful about generalizing about Christianity, we also need to be careful about generalizing about other religious traditions, including Buddhism and Hinduism. Having said that, generally, generally, um, uh, Hindu and Buddhist worldview, the Hindu and Buddhist worldviews tend to understand the cycle of reincarnation, right? Transmigration of souls, sometimes called, such that there is some part of the self, sometimes called the Atman in Sanskrit, that there is an immortal part of the self which does travel from one body to another, right? And is incarnate again and again in different. And so most of you probably are aware of this, right? That there is an internal essence that can move from being a plant to becoming, a marmot, to becoming an earthworm, to becoming a human, or go backwards, depending on how that self has acted in life. So there is the strong presumption that there is the cycle of birth and death, and that there are souls that travel from one body to another. In many views of Vedanta Hinduism as well as Buddhism, the goal is to escape that cycle of birth and death. So the goal is eventually for that soul to either merge with the ultimate, or realize that it already is part of the ultimate, or cease to exist in any kind of individualized way. So that's the general view that I would say, right? And so there is a kind of a dualism, I guess you could say there, that there is a view that the soul continues even when the body dies. Um, um, yes, but there's also variety. So maybe I should just stop there.
No, I think you
Is that
did an
enough?
admirable job with a big question. I think this will be the last one that we have time for.
Mhm.
Um, did Calvin infuse Greek philosophy into our view of soul and body to explain what happens
Yeah.
when we die? If our physical body decays, what goes to heaven, and is this the source of our inability to understand the presence and power of God?
Oh wow. Okay. So that's I love.
One more little softball,
I love.
little easy one.
Right, right, right. So to the first part of the question, did Calvin infuse Greek philosophy? I would say yes, but he wasn't alone in that, right? Calvin was also inheriting um, and being influenced by. So Calvin is part of a large tradition that has been influenced by Greek philosophy, and so yes, I would say that is one of the factors that led to his pretty stark differentiation between body and soul. Now, to what Calvin thought happened after death, interestingly, he did think that the body dies. Um, there was a debate in Calvin's day about what happens to the soul in between death and the final resurrection, and Calvin and Luther, for example, he actually disagreed about this. Calvin thought that the soul was not conscious, so it went into a kind of a sleep state before the final resurrection. But he did believe, along with all classical Christian theologians and most modern theologians, that the Christian hope is for an ultimate bodily resurrection, which does reconstitute the body in some way. So it's not that there is no body in the resurrection. It's just a different kind of a body than the one we have now. So now the last part of that question, though, went in an interestingly different direction. What was the last part of the question?
Is that the source of our inability to understand the power and presence of God?
Is what the source of that?
I, I mean, I will try to answer this, but if the person that asked the question wants to chime in,
Yeah, tell me the last part of that question. Yeah.
Often kind of going, oh, yes. That's nice. Nobody's ever told me that I'm quiet. So yeah, no, you're in the general population of you're very loud. Um, so it kind of goes to the point, the first question of, how are we in the image of God?
Right.
I get the feeling many times as I'll use Calvin as that prison
Yeah.
human body.
Right.
We try and force God to be us.
Mm.
And so as science evolves, and we see that the body decays, or somebody gets cremated or something like that, then it makes it hard for us to say that body
Right.
goes to heaven.
Right.
So what I was looking at is in Calvin's time, as he was separating that, trying to find a way to explain to us simple people that it has to be a dualism, because I know you've seen this happen.
Sure. Sure.
But there is part of you that goes to heaven.
Uh-huh.
And then because we can't wrap our heads around what you just said, that even though somebody is cremated, God can reconstitute that body into an eternal being.
Yeah.
So that was kind of my question was Calvin really reaching out to try and explain to people, yes, there is still the hope, even though you've watched this scientific action happen.
Yeah. I think Calvin did try to hold, he did indeed affirm that there is this ultimate hope for the resurrection, which does reconstitute the body in some way. So he did. And of course, you're right that in some way the body soul dualism is a kind of self-evident, it's a way of trying to account for what we see, right? Bodies do die, bodies do decay, right? So yes, I think what he, along with much of the other early Christian tradition, does unfortunately, is to reinforce a dualism in a way that is not necessary. To say it is not necessary, and it's not necessarily biblically faithful to say that the body and the soul are two radically distinct things, because what that would imply then is that what we do with our bodies does not affect our internal real lives, right? What we name as the soul. That's the problem, I think. And so whatever we say about the final resurrection, which might be another day, um, uh, it we need to be careful about saying that somehow the body that is reconstituted and raised is just a shell, right? It is somehow just a kind of weird container that we need. Like, what would be the point of that? I think the promise of the resurrection tells us that there is something valuable and ultimately integrated about the human person, body and soul, and that we hope ultimately for a world in which those are united and integrated fully, in which the body is not just disposable. Does that sort of get to, I mean, and we could talk more about that later. I do want to, before we leave, give you, share with you, is that okay if I share with you a
Of
little poem?
course.
And in fact, maybe this can serve as our closing prayer. Would that be okay?
That'd be great. Before we do that, will you all join me in expressing your gratitude for Martha and her terrific presentation today? Thank you.
Thank you. And I will just say, for anybody who's interested, I brought along a collection of essays called Neuroscience and the Soul. If you want to take a look at this afterwards, it's up here, a collection of essays by neuroscientists and philosophers and theologians on this question about the status of the soul in contemporary thought. So you're welcome to look at that. I want to close with this is a poem which we'll receive as a prayer by a poet named Lynn Unger. Some of you may have encountered. She's an American poet writing today. This was actually written in 2020, but it is a reflection on the Magnificat. So, and I just pay attention to this language of the soul and what's going on here. So, my soul doth magnify the Lord, said Mary, under circumstances which make it something of a startling utterance. Not, I accept the will of the Lord, not, I bow before the Lord, not even I give thanks to the Lord. No, Mary, this young woman, presumably unfamiliar with angels or divine voices of any kind, let alone those pronouncing that salvation would grow inside her ordinary flesh. This woman, who may be innocent, but hardly seems naive, says something remarkable. My soul magnifies the Lord. Who I am, what I do, how I choose makes God bigger. As if God were to slip between microscope slides and appear in never before seen detail, which is, of course, exactly what happens. Somehow, in being magnified, God gets small, small enough to sleep amongst the straw and the scent of farm animals. God magnified becomes particular, tangible, urgent as a hungry child. And Mary, like so many women before her and after, puts the baby to her breast, for they both grow vast in one another's eyes. Amen.
Thank you all very much.